Hi guys, welcome back to The Learning Gardener. If you haven't been here before, my name is Pip. We are in the kitchen today because it is hot as outside and it is also on and off raining, so it's disgusting and humid. But as you can see, we've got a lot to deal with. These beans have just been picked, mostly from here on was just picked maybe like 20 minutes ago, and these ones were picked 48 hours ago. So we've got a ton of produce to deal with. Still no tomatoes. A lot of the carrots are going to seed, even though the carrots are tiny, but mostly just a ton of scalloped squash, a ton of the round zucchinis, and a ton of the regular zucchinis. Some of the sweet yellow peppers have finally started to turn yellow. I've been eating heaps of them while they're green. These ones are supposed to be red, but they never ever go red. They always get sunburnt and start melting before that can happen. So I grabbed them while they were there and not sunburnt, although one is. So we're going to try and use all of this produce today. We've also got one random turnip that was ready and some lemongrass to use. So we're going to make a bunch of different recipes. Whatever we don't use, I want to start freezing some like stir-fry packs. And last time you guys saw that I used beans and these scallop squash and snow peas from the winter garden and broccoli from the winter garden to make like a peanut butter satay with a rice, noodles and cashews type stir-fry. But there's only so much of that I can eat as one person. And I did crave it a bit through winter, but obviously there's no scallop squash available then. So I am going to freeze some of these and freeze it with some beans. And then I will add some snow peas from the freezer into that pack. And then when we get some more broccoli coming through, I'll add it in. And then at least that way I'll have a bag of frozen veg that's ready to go, ready for a stir fry. And I can just dump it in without having to dig through the freezer to try and find all the various components. So that's what I'll do with some of the leftovers. But I want to try and make as many meals as possible and pop them all in boxes and pop them in the freezer. So I've got a lot of variety to pick from. That's something I've been trying to work on more this year, is trying to turn these things into meals and put them in the freezer rather than just freeze drying or canning, because some things with canning, they have a lot of sugar in them and I don't really want to have that much sugar. Or I've got some beef chuck roast over here defrosting, which I'm going to freeze. Originally I had bought that to can, but I have canned some and it just took forever to can. And I find on the induction stove it takes forever to pressure can something. Even like bone broth, which you only have a 25-minute processing time, but the time taken to get it up to heat is so long on this stove. Even though it's a great stove, but I just find it's not as good doing it on an induction as a gas stove, so I just really can't be bothered to pressure can more meat. And I still haven't tried the meat that I pressure canned before, but I want that out of the freezer. Well, not out of the freezer, but I want that processed into something. I don't want it getting freezer burnt, and I like having all these meals that I can just pluck from. It's been really good lately because it's given me something to focus on doing. It's also meant on the days where I'm having a harder day that I can just get something that's good and nutritious for my body from the freezer without having to deal with it. Which leads me to, I really appreciate everybody's lovely comments lately and your support of late. It has obviously been a very, very difficult time. Christmas has been very, very difficult, much harder than I thought. This week I was supposed to be in Sydney giving birth to my little boy, but unfortunately we know how that turned out. And I don't always want to be on video being messy, and at the moment I am very messy because he was supposed to be here in a few days. So I'm not going to be on the video a lot. I will show you what I'm going to do, but I will do voiceovers later because I'm just not feeling the being on camera. But I am really trying to build up this channel and trying to get it to a point where I can make an income from it. We are almost there, so I really appreciate all of the new subscribers, and I'm sorry I've been a mess in the last few videos, but hopefully you can understand why. and I don't always want to be Debbie Downer, which is why I don't want to be in this video. But I still want to bring you guys along on the journey of what we're doing, especially in summer when there's so much coming out of the garden and there's stuff happening. And I want to try and be consistent with the posts so that the channel can keep growing, so that I don't have to go back to work. To be totally honest, I don't want to go back to work. It's very hard to imagine. Anyway, so I'm going to get on with making a whole bunch of stuff. Some of the recipes come from Deliciously Ella, which I think the app might have been renamed, but it's a English-based chef who had a whole bunch of autoimmune issues like me, and she basically went mostly plant-based and sorted out a lot of her health problems, which is something I'm trying to do, except I still incorporate red meat because I'm not supposed to eat chicken. It's not good for me, and I don't really eat a lot of turkey, and I can't eat fish, and I can't eat crab, and I find if I don't eat red meat, my iron just gets way too low, even with supplementation and even with deliberate choice of what I eat. But I'm also trying to bulk up my fiber to try and heal my gut as much as I can, to try and get my body as healthy as I can. And so obviously that also means I'm trying to use a lot more of the veg from the garden to maximize that fiber consumption, to try and just be better. So I hope you guys enjoy the video. Thank you so much for all the recent support. Thank you for all the recent subscribers. And I hope you enjoy this video, and I'm sorry for being Debbie Downer. See you guys around. The first freezer meal we're going to be making is from Deliciously Ella, and it's one of my favorites. It's a sweet potato, lemongrass, and coconut curry. It freezes beautifully, and I love this so much, but I haven't had it in ages, so I'm going to be making a triple batch. You want 2 large sweet potatoes, and you cut them into small cubes, and you're going to cover them in some olive oil, a pinch of cumin, some turmeric, salt and pepper, and mix it all up and make sure everything is coated well. Roast it for about 35 to 40 minutes, just until it's golden, not until it's totally roasted. Because I had a few extra sweet potatoes in this, I did need to make up some extra spice, just to make sure that everything was well covered. You want to make sure the flavor is rich in this curry, and just make sure everything's got a light coating of your turmeric and your cumin. Next up is half a butternut squash, or in this case 1.5, that need to be peeled and cut up into bite-sized pieces. You're then going to cover it in oil and pop it in the oven for 25 to 30 minutes. You just want the pumpkin to be soft. You don't want it to be fully roasted. So you want to get it out just before it starts to get that real charring and colouring on it. The recipe calls for 1 onion and 2 cloves of garlic, but I am very pro garlic and very anti things like ginger. So I will almost never put ginger in anything, and I will always put way more garlic than a recipe calls for, and I'm usually a little bit heavy-handed with salt as well. That's a personal preference. I'm lucky also that my blood pressure is not high. I generally have lower side of normal, so perhaps that's why I'm a little bit fond of the salt. But you want to make sure things are nice and tasty, so I definitely recommend more than 2 cloves of garlic with this. Then this is the first time I'm using my homegrown lemongrass. You want to get 1 stalk of lemongrass because I'm making 3 batches, and these are skinny stalks, and I didn't know how potent homegrown lemongrass would be. I got a whole bunch, and you want to smash them up so that the flavor can seep out into the curry really nicely. I usually find at this point my sweet potato and chickpeas and pumpkin are ready to come out of the oven. This gives me a chance to let the lemongrass sit in with the onions and the garlic for a few minutes to let that flavor really get in there. Then I get the pumpkin and I pop it in with the onions and the lemongrass. And you want to also add a can of coconut milk at this point and bring it to a boil, then let it simmer for 10 to 15 minutes. At this point, I realized that there was no way that all of this stuff was going to fit in my one large pot. So I busted out my water bath canning pot and I transferred everything in there. And even though I might have been able to fill it all in this one cooking pot, I think it would have been a very, very full blitz and it might have ended up all over the kitchen. So I was glad that I transferred it in. It also just made it a little bit easier to balance a hot roasting pan on and just flick everything into the wider mouth of the larger pot. After simmering for 10 to 15 minutes, the pumpkin should be totally and completely soft, and that means it's time to get the lemongrass out and to get out your hand blender and blitz this to the consistency you like. You can add water if you need to get a thinner consistency if that's what you like, but I tend to find it's really, really nice just as it is, and as I said, I serve it on rice, so I quite like a chunky, thick mixture. Once you've done that, it's pretty much done. You just pop in the sweet potato and the chickpeas and mix them through, and then pop in a handful, or in my case 3 handfuls of chopped baby spinach, and just mix it all through as you remove it from heat and just let those flavors get mixed in there, and then you are all done and this beautiful meal is ready to go. I tend to freeze this meal in larger portions just because it is quite chunky, and I do tend to get cravings for it. And so when I defrost it, I'm quite happy to eat it for 2 nights in a row. One of the difficulties sometimes of cooking for one person is that you end up eating the same meal 600 nights in a row and you get sick of it, and not everything freezes well, so it's really nice to be able to have something that is this tasty that freezes really, really well. Obviously you can freeze it in whatever size portion you want, but I tend to do 2 nights of this meal, and I find it stays perfect in the freezer for months on end, so there's no real hurry to get through this, and it's beautiful. Really recommend this meal. Totally gluten-free and nice and plant-based. The other meals I made this week for the freezer were a beef stew and braised beef chuck roast. So the chuck roast I'm planning to use as a taco meat, and again, as always, way more garlic than recommended. I have grown this year for the first time successfully my own garlic, and I really like using the New Zealand red garlic. It is so aromatic and strong, but I do find I can only peel one batch at a time because I find it's so strong that it actually burns my fingers. So this recipe asked for slow cooking of the chuck roast because it's a tough meat and it requires quite a while in the oven at a low temperature. And it was pretty simple. It was just lay the meat on top of a bed of red onions and put little pieces of garlic in the meat and season it with salt and pepper, and pop in 1 cup of beef bone broth to help the slow cooking process. I had quite a bit of bone broth in the fridge that really needed to be used, so I was a little bit liberal with the bone broth, and also because the meat was piled high, I thought it might need a little bit more, but I wrapped it in foil and popped it in the oven. The recipe said that it was going to take about 3 hours in the oven, but that was not true. It took about 7. But that's the nice thing about slow cooking. You can just pop it in and check on it periodically while you do other jobs throughout the day. I had one other pack of chuck roasts that I'd picked up from Costco when I was last in Sydney, and the beef stew wanted the meat braised on both sides, so I did that and then got the garlic and the onions and popped some balsamic vinegar on them and made sure everything was well and truly covered and well mixed in, and then it was time to get that on the stove and get that cooking in the juice of the meat. The recipe calls for 1.5 tablespoons of tomato paste, but I don't like to waste a tin of tomato paste, so I just chucked the whole little tin in, and then I mixed in 1/4 cup of all-purpose gluten-free flour. You are supposed to do this in the pot with the beef in, but there's no way my pot is big enough, and I didn't want to be cooking this on the stove for 4 hours. I wanted to put it in my slow cooker. So then I just added the 2 cups of dry red wine, 2 cups of beef broth, which again I was a little bit generous with because I had plenty in the fridge and it needed to be used, 2 cups of water, and 1 bay leaf, 1/2 teaspoon of dried thyme, 1.5 teaspoons of sugar, and I popped that all on the stove and made sure I got all the juices off the bottom of the pan before I eventually transferred this into the slow cooker along with the meat. Generally, I find when I cook things that are supposed to be slow cooked in the oven in the slow cooker that they take about an extra hour, hour and a half, but this took a really, really long time. This was supposed to cook for 3.5 hours in the oven, and I had to leave it overnight till the next day until it was able to be shredded, because after 6 or 7 hours during the daytime, it was still not even slightly shreddable. So sometimes a slow cooker does take a lot longer to get your meal ready. So for dinner that night, I made slow cooked zucchini and creamy butter beans. And this is a nice way to use up your zucchini. So you want to use 2 zucchinis and thinly slice them. And then with your third zucchini, you can julienne it, or you can grate it and squeeze out any extra liquid. And this recipe is also from Deliciously Ella. So this is another one of her recipes. As I said, they're all plant-based. I decided to just do a rough julienne for the third zucchini and get that ready for the stove. This called for 4 cloves of garlic, so again I put in a little bit extra, but not a lot extra. Got that diced up and into the bowl, and I also got 100 grams of pine nuts getting started and warmed up on the stove as well, while I got the garlic going and golden on the stove as well. I'm a bit of a wimp when it comes to spice, so I only put a little bit of chili flakes in because it did say only put a pinch, but I think next time I would probably put a little bit more. As we all know, zucchinis can be hard to use up, so I think a little bit of extra flavor with the zucchinis is never a bad thing. So to start off with, I needed to soften the slices of zucchini while I was getting the pine nuts ready and starting the rest of the pesto that's going to go on top of this dish. This is not a freezer meal dish, but it is a nice way to use up your zucchinis and something a little bit different to try. You need a handful of basil and a handful of parsley to make the pesto. I didn't have any parsley fresh in the garden, so I just used some I'd freeze-dried from last year. A little pinch of salt, and then you add the pine nuts once they're ready and blitz it all to the desired consistency. Mix in a little bit of olive oil, and your pesto is easy and ready to go and nice and full of flavour. Should take about 15 or 20 minutes for the zucchini to soften. Then you want to pop in your can of butter beans, juice and all. Pop in a little bit of salt and your grated or julienned zucchini, and then just cook this for another 5 minutes to let some of the moisture cook out of the recipe. If you use veggie stock cubes, you can also add one for a little bit of extra flavor. I make a veggie stock paste, which is the Thermomix recipe, and I love this stuff. And again, I'm very liberal with this stock paste. So I put a good 2.5 tablespoons into this mixture. While I was cooking the zucchinis for another 5 minutes to get the moisture out of the recipe, it was time to get the creamy side of this recipe ready. So I'm using a coconut yogurt, freeze-dried lemon skin. So I don't have fresh lemons at the moment, but I have previously freeze-dried a stack of lemon skin from the last house I lived in that had a massive, very prolific lemon tree. My current lemon tree is very teeny tiny, so I might get 2 lemons this year if I'm lucky. I did actually end up adding a little bit more lemon because I like my lemon flavors in things to really have a kick, but generally freeze-dried powders are pretty intense. You want to put a little bit of salt and pepper in, mix it up, and pop it in the dish and mix it through. I wasn't convinced that this was going to be all that nice, but it was lovely. What I find really, really improved it was I popped a little bit of bacon in it the next day, which I guess is against the rules if you're doing plant-based. But as I said, I don't do plant-based, and I don't eat a lot of bacon because bacon's not really my thing. But it really did bring this dish to a whole next level. But it was really nice, and a nice way to use zucchini without feeling like you're always eating the same old zucchini dish. I hadn't started cooking till the afternoon, so by the time I got all of this done and ate my dinner, I couldn't be bothered to do another zucchini dish with the beans, which was what I was planning, and I could already see more beans that I'd missed on the trellis, so I thought I'm just going to blanch and freeze the rest of these, and once they're frozen up, I will make the stir fry packs that I talked about. And I still had to keep checking on the chuck roasts. As you can see, after about 5 hours, this one was almost shreddable. It was just enough that I could pull it into chunks and kind of make sure everything was more in the broth and in the juices. So I did my best to make sure everything was covered and submerged, wrapped it up and popped it back in the oven for another 2 hours while I worked on the beans and got them all blanched and ready for the freezer. I ended up with 4 large freeze dryer trays very full of green beans in the freezer, so I was really stoked with how much I've got. As I said, this is not the first harvest of the beans. I've been out there plucking from them regularly. Every 3 days or so I'm getting a massive bowl full of them, so it's almost at the point where I kind of don't know what to do with these beans anymore. And a lot of zucchini meals and bean meals generally are better eaten fresh, and I do not like canned beans, so I am trying to work out how I'm going to get through all the beans, so if you've got any ideas, let me know below. But finally, before I went to bed, the taco meat was done. As I said, the one in the slow cooker was nowhere near done and needed to stay in overnight, but you can see this is now beautiful and soft and absolutely pulling apart perfectly. It did need to go back in the oven for a bit of braising, and then I could package it up, pop it in the fridge once it had cooled down, and then pop it in the freezer for later use. It didn't make as much as I thought it would. I think there's probably enough in these boxes for about 2 meals worth. But I did think, looking at the size of those steaks, that it was going to turn into a lot more. But I think by the time you've had maybe 2 tacos, this is 2 nights worth per box. So we've got maybe 8 meals out of those 3 huge, ginormous steaks, which is pretty cool to have that popped away for a rainy day in the freezer. Both of the chuck roasts are now finally done. This one I had to leave in overnight to actually get the meat to be a shreddable consistency. Before that, it was just too tough after even like 7 hours in the slow cooker. So now all I need to do is add the potatoes and the carrots, and this one is done. The other one took about 6 or 7 hours in the oven. So both took way longer than the recipe said, which is fine. But I mean, slow cooker is definitely the correct name for this device. But I thought they would both be faster just because they were steaks as opposed to a big chunk. But obviously not. So it's a very tough cut of meat, but hopefully a very tasty meal. It is really hot and humid at the moment, so I find I tend to duck out into the garden first thing in the morning and late at night, and the rest of the time I'm inside. And I was delighted on this day to discover the first blackberries I've ever grown, and they're so tasty and so beautiful and fat and juicy, so different compared to store-bought. This is my new favorite cookbook. I have 2 of Amy Chaplin's books, and all of her recipes are pretty much plant-based. And it's really interesting because I can actually eat everything in her recipe book, which is not the case that I usually discover happens when I get excited about a cookbook. So I've been trying more and more of her recipes, including this one, which made a lovely lentil soup for lunch, which we have also now frozen. The recipe called for 5 cloves of garlic minced, but I figured if I was peeling garlic, I was going to do a whole head. So once again, we filled the pot up with onions and tons of garlic, but there's never enough garlic. Then it was time to pop 2 cups of red lentils in that had been washed and drained. I was making a double batch, so there was quite a bit of red lentil stickage by the time I got to popping them in. Then calls for 6 cups of filtered water, and more if you need to thin it out. You want 1.5 teaspoons of salt, although I tend to find that Amy Chaplin and I disagree on how much salt should be in things, and then 1/4 to 1/2 teaspoon of freshly ground black pepper. The recipe calls for 4 cups of baby spinach leaves. I didn't have any spinach on hand, my spinach has gone to seed, so all I had were the remaining 2 bags of frozen spinach that we'd harvested a couple of weeks ago. I have no idea how much it amounted to, so I just tossed it in, and it was going to have to be enough. Then, right when you finished cooking, after simmering away for about 30 to 35 minutes, and the lentils are completely broken down, you want to remove it from heat, add 1/4 cup of lemon juice and mix it in well, and then it's ready to serve. While I was waiting for the lentil soup to cook, I started making a triple batch of what I call muesli bars, but they're not actually muesli bars because they have no muesli in them. They are a nut bar, and they are my new favorite thing. I use the vanilla almond snack bar recipe from Sally's Baking Addiction as a loose guide. So she recommends 1/3 of a cup of honey, 1 teaspoon of vanilla extract, but I'd like more, 1/4 cup of almond meal, 1/8 of a teaspoon of salt, 1 tablespoon of almond butter, 1 1/3 cups of whole almonds chopped, 5 dates, and 3/4 of a cup of sunflower seeds. I like a little bit more almond butter. I also like a bit more dates, and I like to add cranberries to my dried cranberries. Sometimes I will mix the nuts up, so I will add cashews and macadamia nuts, and it's a very loose mixture that I use, but it turns out beautifully. Now, these can be really, really sticky and they're quite hard to mix together, so you do have to put in a little bit of muscle to get the whole recipe mixed together and then get it flattened out on a baking sheet where you're going to cook it at 150 degrees or 300 Fahrenheit for about 20 minutes. You then want to let it sit on your bench top for about an hour to cool, and then another hour at least in the fridge so it can set. But I don't find that these bars ever, even if I'm following the recipe exactly, ever hold their structure perfectly like muesli bars from the store do. But you can store these in the freezer, so that's where I store them. And I pull one bar out as I want it. I like them when they're fairly fresh out of the freezer and they're quite hard, but you can let them come back up to room temperature. They will still be a bar, but they will be a sticky bar. And I prefer when they're not as sticky, but these are so good. And I tend to make triple batches at a time because I smash them. My best friend's kids smash them when they come to visit me. They only live 3 doors down, so they're around a fair bit. So it's a nice, healthy snack to have on standby. Yes, it still has honey in it. Yes, it will still get your glucose levels up a little bit, but the nutritional benefits of eating this compared to something from the supermarket. And I just love that you can store them in the freezer and make as many as you need. They do take a while to package up, and it's probably not ideal from a packaging perspective, so I do have to try and work out a better way around that. I like the baking paper around it so that you're not touching the sticky bar and you can just peel it back as you eat it. On this occasion I had a happy little helper to keep me entertained while I was rolling all these up. My best friend's daughter, who lives 3 doors down, came and played with my dogs because her brothers were annoying her, so it was lovely to have someone to chat to while I got these ready for the freezer. The last freezer recipe for this video and another zucchini recipe is I decided to try and make some zucchini lasagna. I wanted to try and use the round zucchinis because I find them difficult to use because they have such a huge seed pocket in the middle, and that's usually because they grow faster than I can keep up with them. But I decided in the end mostly to stick with regular zucchinis, and I used my oversized zucchinis for this, salted them and baked them in the oven for 10 to 15 minutes at 200 degrees to take some of the moisture out of them. Then I got my onion, garlic and mince in the pot. I added some whole broccoli that had been diced up. I added some freeze-dried capsicum from last year. I added some tomato paste, some tomato concentrate, some diced tomatoes, and a whole bag of cauliflower and a bunch of beef broth just to make up my meat mixture. Now you can put whatever you like in your meat mixture. I was trying to use as many vegetables as I could, and I just dumped it all in there, and a tiny bit of salt and pepper just to kind of season it, although my beef bone broth is seasoned already. And then because I wanted to use up my beef bone broth and I put quite a bit in there, I did need to simmer it for quite a while to reduce the amount of liquid, because you don't want your lasagna turning into a soup, which I figured, given it's being made with zucchini, is already risky. And then I put about 2 tablespoons worth of Italian herbs in to cook that with. While that was cooking down, I started to get the bechamel sauce ready, and I just made a very standard bechamel sauce recipe. It was just butter, gluten-free flour, and milk. And then, because I wanted it to be nice and cheesy, I did add some grated cheese once the mixture had thickened. After about an hour of cooking, I blitzed the mince up to kind of a chunky texture. I didn't want it to be super thin like a bolognese mixture. I wanted it to be close to, but not quite. And then I started layering things up in some glass jars that can be frozen and also can be used as baking dishes. So I did meat layer first, then zucchini layer, and then the cheese layer. The only problem was that by the time I'd done the cheese layer, I was putting the grated mozzarella on and going, oh my gosh, I'm not going to have enough cheese to do this. How is it normally so cheesy? And then I continued on and realized I'd forgotten the bechamel sauce. So I did have to scrape the mince off and go back and add the bechamel sauce. So it was a little bit more time consuming to construct these than I had planned, but it's been such a long time since I made lasagna, because I got sick of vegetarian gluten-free lasagna, and I found that it didn't really taste as nice as a regular lasagna. So I was quite happy with the way these turned out, and happy to go back and do it properly with a bechamel sauce and make sure it had all the trimmings that a lasagna should have. All but one of these got put in the freezer, and once it had cooled down, and I cooked one for dinner that night. And while it was in the oven, it did look like a soup, and I was very worried that that's what it was going to be. But oh my word, it smelled absolutely fantastic. You couldn't taste the zucchini. It was fantastic, and I'll be making this again. It did kind of fall apart when I was dishing it out, but I'm not worried about that at all. The taste was amazing, and perhaps I need to get braver and use my mandolin rather than fearing it's always going to chop off my hand. But it still worked with the thick pieces of zucchini. It was still really, really tasty, and it's a great way to use quite a bit of zucchini, and I plan to make a lot more of this and get my freezer full. I hope you guys have enjoyed these freezer meals and some snack ideas, and I'll see you in the next video.